Okay, welcome back. It's Derek Varnadoe for Solid Source Real Estate Companies, and we are continuing the fun. So if you have watched the first, second, third, and fourth parts of the series, Transaction Confidence, Working with Buyers and Sellers, is a class that's been approved for 3 hours of continuing education by the Georgia Real Estate Commission. So this class is offered routinely here at Solid Source, and if you haven't attended my class, there's so much information. The class is a little bit different every time based on the questions that I receive. It's a very interactive class, and it's a lot of fun. We dive deep into contracts, but this is a supplemental video to that. And in this video, we're going to answer 10 frequently asked questions, contract questions, transaction questions based on the Georgia Association of Realtors purchase and sale agreement. So if you're ready to learn, I'm ready. Let's go ahead and dive in. Our first question, how do I handle signatures when the seller is an LLC? Maybe it's the buyer, maybe it's a corporation, but essentially the buyer or the seller is an entity. It's not Jane Doe, it's not John Doe. So how is that going to be handled? So the contract does need to be in the name of the company, and it's going to be signed by a person though. And it's going to be signed by a person with signing authority, such as a member, such as a president. And if you simply fill in for the name of the seller, the name of the entity, typically when a party receives a request to sign a document through an e-sign platform, such as FMLS Remind Docs Plus, maybe it's DocuSign, they typically are going to have the ability to change the name. So they can simply fill in, for example, John Doe member, however they need to actually sign. So the contract will be in the name of the entity, signed by a person, and ideally disclosing their signing authority. So great question. Number two, so if the binding agreement date is the first of the month and the earnest money is due within 2 days, when are the funds due? So this is an exercise on counting timeframes in the GAR contract. So if the binding date is the first, 2, 3. So the third of the month would be the last day, and the party would have through 11:59 p.m. that night to turn those funds in. So for counting purposes, the actual binding agreement date is going to be 0. Then the next day will be day 1, and so on. So if the binding date is the first, and you've got 2 days to turn that earnest money in, the buyer has through 11:59 p.m. on that third day. Do weekends and holidays count when measuring timeframes for due diligence and contingencies? All days count unless the contract specifically stipulates otherwise. I'll go ahead and just tag onto this that the only event that's going to change in the GAR contract, if it were to happen to fall on a weekend or a holiday, is the date of closing. So even though we're looking at those calendars, if you're using FMLS Remind, it's not going to it shouldn't let you pick a holiday or a weekend. But if by some chance it still happens, the closing date would automatically be pushed to the next business day. Okay, so number 4, should I include the property sold with right to request repairs exhibit or negotiate a due diligence period? So frequently asked question, especially in an extreme seller's market. I would encourage a due diligence period for all parties. A short due diligence period, 2 or 3 days, 4 days, whatever you guys agree to, is going to be cleaner. It's going to be easier for the parties to understand. The property sold with right to request repairs exhibit is very confusing for agents. It's confusing for brokers. And I haven't seen too many home inspections that come back perfect. And so that form, if you look at it closely, it defines what a defect is. And it's not maybe the same definition you or I would have thought that it would be. So I would use that form with extreme caution. And I would encourage a traditional due diligence period over the property sold with right to request repairs. And if the seller says they're selling the home as is, definitely want to go with the due diligence and not the property sold with right to request repairs. Okay, so number 5, if the property condition changes, is the seller required to update the seller's property disclosure statement? Absolutely. And I'm just going to go ahead and reiterate here, as I did in the class, a seller's property disclosure statement is never required. No specific disclosure form is ever required, even though it's common for a seller's disclosure and a community association disclosure to be attached to the contract. What a seller is required to disclose, and an agent, if they know of this, are any latent or hidden defects with the property that a buyer could not reasonably discover. If a seller is going to complete a property disclosure statement, they need to answer all of the questions honestly and to the best of their ability, and keep it updated if things change. And if a seller looks at that disclosure form and they feel like, you know what, I really just don't know the answer to some of these questions, maybe it's an investment property and they've never even lived there, maybe they haven't lived there in a very long time, then it probably is going to be better not to fill the form out. Now, GAR does have a condensed seller's disclosure form, a disclosure of latent defects and fixtures checklist. So it's a very short form. It includes the fixtures checklist, which most people find to be an extreme benefit of that seller's disclosure. So just know the disclosure is not required unless there are hidden defects that need to be disclosed. And if the seller hasn't lived there and they don't feel comfortable answering all of those questions in the traditional disclosure, there is a condensed version available in the GAR forms package. Okay, so number 6, can the GAR contract be assigned to another buyer? No, not unless the contract is stipulated to say that it can be. The boilerplate language in the GAR contract that we talked about in class, it says that the contract is not to be assigned without the express written permission of the seller. So if you are a buyer making an offer to purchase and your goal is to assign it, this is not popular, but you would need to put a special stipulation in the contract. When it comes to assignments or wholesaling, as some call it, I do want to encourage you to reach out if you're a solid source agent to your broker team. Let's have a conversation about that and help keep you in a good place, because those can be very complicated transactions, and it's very important to understand what's going on in those situations. Okay, so number 7, can I work with a buyer to make an offer on my listing? Note, my broker does not offer dual agency. So if you're licensed here at Solid Source, we don't offer dual agency. Most brokers in Georgia don't offer dual agency, but you could work with a buyer to make an offer on your property. You would need to disclose to that buyer that the seller is your client and the buyer would simply be a customer. So remember the ABCs of agency form that I've talked about in the past and in class. That form is so helpful to give to a party when you disclose to them that the seller is your client and you can work with them as a customer. Here's a form, the ABCs of agency, that helps to give you more information about agency and brokerage relationships that may be helpful to you, and they can make the best decision for themselves. And I'll just piggyback on that, of course, that no specific form is required to be signed for a customer, but GAR does have an agreement to work with buyer as a customer form, and it is a wonderful form. If the buyer is willing to sign that form, again, it helps to disclose that relationship and offers protection to the agent and to the broker. Okay, so question number 8, can a buyer make offers to purchase multiple properties at the same time? And if so, what are the risks? So technically they can, but they don't want to be binding under more than one contract unless they truly can purchase more than one property, right? So I would absolutely encourage in this case to be extremely careful. You're going to need to babysit this if you're the agent. You need to have a due diligence in all of those, right? Because if you're making multiple offers with no due diligence, that would be a big problem. I would not recommend that. But just as soon as one of those contracts is accepted, you would want to very quickly withdraw all of those other offers, unless the time limit, if you included a time limit, unless that time limit has expired. And again, GAR offers a notice to withdraw offer or counteroffer form that a buyer or a seller can sign to formally withdraw an offer if that time limit has not expired, or maybe there wasn't a time limit in the offer at all and you need to formally take that offer off of the table. Number 9, what is a 10-day letter? So a 10-day letter is in relation to a termination. So it happens after a deal terminates. It's in regards to the earnest money. So a 10-day letter is a notice regarding the disbursement of earnest money. So let me give you an example. The contract terminates, the parties cannot agree as to who is going to receive the earnest money. At that point, the holder can get involved. They have a right to do that based on the boilerplate language in the GAR contract. They can review the contract, make a reasonable decision based on their own interpretation of the agreement, and they send out a notice. They wait 10 days, and then they disperse the funds. Can a party, when I say a party, can the buyer or the seller dispute what the holder has stated that they're going to do in this 10-day letter? Absolutely. But ultimately, it is up to the holder. The holder gets to make that choice, and everyone has agreed in the GAR contract to hold the holder harmless. Now, if it is a cash transaction and the closing attorney is going to be the holder, they will not send a 10-day letter. They will interplead those funds. So that is included in the separate agreements that are signed when the attorney is the earnest money holder. So in the event of a cash deal, I would probably let Solid Source Realty hold the funds, because if the attorney is the holder, they are instructed per the contract to interplead those funds. Okay, and finally, question number 10, the listing agent sent me a text saying, my buyer's offer was the winner, later to apologize and say the seller chose another offer that came in last minute. Legal? Well, this is not good business practice. What I would just really stress to everybody, two big things here is, until you have a contract signed, you don't have a contract. The time it takes to text someone else or call them or email them and say, hey, congratulations, your offer's been accepted, just don't do that. Until the seller signs it and that notice, it's actually been sent over to the other party, there is no winner. There is no contract. And so I would be a filter if I'm the buyer's agent and that actually happens, and I know sometimes it does. And if I'm disclosing that information to the buyer, I would let them know the listing agent has stated this. This is good news. It's promising, but until we have a contract back signed by the seller, we do not have an agreement. Maybe my response to the listing agent would be, that's awesome. When can you send me back the signed contract? Because until it's signed and notice of acceptance has been delivered, the seller technically could accept another offer. And in an extreme seller's market like the one that we're experiencing today, offers are coming in all the time, depending on the price point. They may be coming in from investors, they may be all cash. So it's never a contract until it's signed and it has been delivered. So hope you found these 10 contract questions helpful.